Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. This is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine. Today's topic, how best to motivate an adolescent with ADHD, is a universal problem for parents who raise teens. Perhaps this might be an accurate description of what goes on in your home. When you are not sick with worry, you are nagging your teen, or maybe you are fighting with him or her. You are so anxious about his or her future that you constantly pester him or her about homework and upcoming tests. To others, he looks like a nice kid, soft-spoken, engaging, and polite, but to you, he seems unmotivated, maybe even lazy. All of your begging, pleading, and berating have failed to light the fire of motivation under him or her. We have with us today clinical psychologist Adam Price, who, as they say, wrote the book on motivation in teens with ADHD. He is the author of He's Not Lazy, Empowering Your Son to Believe in Himself. He has worked with children, adolescents, and their families for more than 25 years. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, Family Circle, and Psychology Today, as well as academic publications. The sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar is Winston Preparatory School, a highly individualized and responsive setting for 10 to 21-year-olds in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey with learning differences, such as language processing disorders, dyslexia, nonverbal learning disabilities, Asperger's, ADHD, and executive functioning difficulties. Winston's unique model of education provides intense skill remediation and helps students build independence, responsibility, self-awareness, and self-advocacy. Key for our students is the focus on assessment-based remediation, a daily one-to-one focus program, skill-based curriculum, small homogeneous class groupings, expert faculty, social, emotional development, and a supportive community. Learn more about Winston and sign up for an open house by visiting www.winstonprep.edu/apply-now. That all being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Price. Dr. Price, it's great to have you here today.
Wayne, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for turning out a phenomenal magazine. I have had Attitude in my waiting room for years. Patients are always asking if they can borrow it. It really is just such a service to parents out there, both adults who have ADHD as well as their kids. So I want to start there. And also, I happen to know Winston. It's a great. They run a great organization. They've been in New York for years. They've been expanding, and they have top staff. I'm always happy to refer someone there as well. I just happen to know them. So attention deficit disorder kills motivation. Some even think that ADHD impacts motivation as much as it does attention. Though medication is often necessary and focusing too much on the biological aspects of the disorder, I fear we sometimes overlook its psychological effect. This happens no place more than with motivation, which is actually one of the reasons I wrote the book, He's Not Lazy, Empowering Your Son to Believe in Himself. I really had the parents of ADHD kids in mind. It's also why Dr. Ned Hallowell, I was fortunate enough to have write a blurb for the back cover. ADHD is like a big magnifying glass. It makes every problem with motivation larger. Now, there are three issues we're going to focus on today, ones that will deeply affect your son's motivation and that are most vulnerable, I think, to the impact of ADHD. These include the pressure your son's under, his need to separate from you, and his quest to grow from boy to man, his quest for masculinity. And here I'm going to touch on some gender differences in learning. As we will see, these issues come together to create a perfect storm. We're going to talk about that storm, and then we'll talk about some things that you can do. Now, much has been written about kids and the pressure they're under today, but the media tends to focus on the problems of a super-achieving academic elite. These kids, they're enrolled in multiple AP classes, they volunteer at local soup kitchens, they master an obtuse Chinese classical instrument, and they hold down spots on several sports teams. And though these kids, whose parents take a Harvard or bust mentality, are under real pressure, there's another typically overlooked class of boys who manifest their stress in different, less obvious ways. They make time for Instagram, video games, sports, friends. But when it comes to school, many do the minimum that's required to get by. They fly under the radar of official trouble. And though they cause their parents a lot of grief and consternation, on the outside, they look impervious to academic pressure. But their behavior is, in fact, a direct response to the stress they're experiencing. So contrary to appearances, these kids aren't just lazy. Rather, they're overcome by demands they fear they simply cannot meet. And so what happens is that in the face of pressure they feel they cannot handle, they choose to opt out of the competition altogether. Opt-outs. So many of the boys that I see with ADD and ADHD fit this description. These boys, they opt out because they're under too much pressure. There's a growing concern that boys are lagging behind girls both academically and emotionally. And in reading the literature, I've read a lot of studies that show girls outperform boys in every subject and that the gender gap is actually growing. There was a recent analysis that looked at 370 studies. They had 1 million subjects in all, and they found that girls perform boys in every academic subject, including science, and that this is a worldwide problem. Now, some even argue, they write about there being a boy crisis, that boys and girls should be educated differently because their brains are so different. Well, I don't jump on that bandwagon because by adulthood, there are very few differences between the brains of men and women, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And the truth is that girls have been doing better in school than boys have since the beginning of compulsory education. What's changed is that now we know a woman can do any job a man can do, and so the workforce is wide open for women. Obviously, there's still some limitations, some glass ceilings, but that is what's changed, not how they do in school. The problem is that people don't realize that boys are not ready for what's asked of them. They need more time to grow and develop than girls do, and boys with ADHD need even more time. Some people say 20% more time. I'm reminded of a story. I was asked to do a consultation for a family that lived in Pennsylvania in the Lehigh Valley, and they got a call from the headmaster of the private school their son was attending that he wasn't able to keep up with his peers. He wasn't able to write in sentences, write the paragraphs that the other kids in the class could do. So I drove out there. I had a look in the classroom. I walked into his kindergarten classroom. And I said to the headmaster, don't you think it's a lot to ask kindergartners to be able to write in full sentences and paragraphs? And she said, oh, no, not at our school. So the parents wisely transferred him to another school, and he did just fine. That story reminds me of a conversation I had recently with a kindergarten teacher who had been in the business, in the field of educating kindergartners for 25 years. And she said when she first started out as a young teacher, youngsters were expected to be able to count from 1 to 10 on the first day of school. Now it's 1 to 100. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about adolescent development. Here's a test. What is the major task of adolescent development? Is it to beat Borderlands, Halo, Call of Duty, to collect 1,000 friends on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever the newest app is? Or C, to establish a sense of oneself as competent and independent, and to develop an emerging sense of purpose and identity in the world? Well, obviously the answer is C. Unless, of course, you're this guy, Alfred E. Neuman, or this guy, Peter Pan. They don't want to grow up. Now, as I write in the book, puberty is a river that separates childhood from adulthood. The bridge that crosses that river, that carries your son from dependence to independence, is called ambivalence. Many people think that ambivalence means indifference. Going to the movies tonight, I could take it or leave it. However, what ambivalence really means is I want to go to the movies, and I really don't want to go to the movies. So in order to be successful, your son will have to stop depending on you the same way he did when he was younger. He's going to have to learn to rely on himself. But what he won't tell you is that he also wants to stay a little kid so he can keep depending on you. When he's arguing about getting a later curfew, he's asserting his independence. However, when he doesn't pick up after himself, forgets to bring his history paper to school, or acts like a 2-year-old, he's acting out his dependence. And this cartoon says, give him a snack and you feed him for a day. Teach him to fix his own snack and your kitchen will be a wreck forever. So how does ADHD magnify this problem? Well, for many boys, especially those with ADHD, who deep down question whether they have what it takes to make it in school, in the world, their ambivalence gets acted out in school. Most kids tell me that they want to do better, but they're afraid to try and fail. So what happens is parents of kids with ADHD, they do more for their kids than children who don't have the disorder. Now, this added involvement was a good thing when your son was younger. You kept him organized, you kept him focused, you kept him on top of things. The problem is, just when school becomes more challenging, changing classes, keeping things in lockers, harder material, adolescence strikes. See, at this point, your son no longer wants your help, and I see this over and over again. He doesn't want it because parental intervention becomes an even bigger threat to his burgeoning independence and as well as his need to separate from you. This is why teens with ADHD can be even more oppositional and defiant than their peers at this age, right around middle school. So now you as a parent, you have this dilemma, this quandary, because your son still needs your help. Maybe even he needs it more than he used to, but he's no longer going to accept it. And he's probably not going to be polite when he refuses it. So at this point, you're on a collision course with your son, which I call and write about in the book, the paradoxical response. The paradox is that the harder you try to motivate him, the more unmotivated he becomes. However, he's not just being defiant, he's not being lazy, and he's not even unmotivated. As I said a few minutes ago, when I speak to these kids in my office, they truly want to do better. So there's more going on here. There's more beneath the surface. And to understand it, we need to take a walk back over that bridge of ambivalence. When someone is ambivalent, they often flip-flop between both sides of the decision internally. However, sometimes the ambivalence can be shared between two people. Now, the best example I can come up with is when a young couple is deciding whether to have a baby or not. As long as one member of that partnership decides that they're not ready, that they need to advance in their career, make more money, whatever it is, travel more, their partner is free to fantasize about having the baby, about painting the nursery room, whatever color they want, because they know that the spouse's feelings are holding them back. But what happens usually is the one who was not so gung-ho gradually decides, yeah, maybe it'd be a good time to have a baby. Well, then all of a sudden, the partner who was all ready to go for it now realizes, oh my goodness, this could really happen. And so then they start to have the other side of the ambivalence. Maybe we're not ready. With your son's school achievement, what happens is that the conflict, the ambivalence doesn't flip-flop. You take up all the worrying side of the conflict so he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to worry about whether he's going to make it. He doesn't have to worry about whether he's smart enough. He doesn't have to worry about his future. You do that, and that keeps him free to avoid his schoolwork because now you've become the problem. So by defying you and by defying school, he actually thinks he's asserting his independence. I call this the plot of false independence. But what he's really doing is he's sabotaging every chance there is for him to become more self-reliant. So before we get into what to do about this, we need to account for one more issue to really understand the underpinning of motivation with teens with ADHD. Now, although girls do opt out, and though much of my book I think is helpful to parents of daughters, when I started this project, I felt there must be some issues pertinent to boys. So I looked at the gender differences in learning literature. And what I found really surprised me. Although, as I said earlier, by adulthood, men and women have acquired the same cognitive skills. Boys and girls develop these same skills at a different rate and in a different order. So what happens is small differences starting in infancy can be amplified by the time kindergarten starts. Girls' rate and order of development is a better fit for school. So they're better at listening, sitting still, paying attention. That's why girls are made of sugar and spice and everything nice. And there's one more thing that's important to girls. They're more interested in pleasing adults. Boys, they don't really give a hoot. So for some boys, school is overwhelming from the beginning. And this is especially true of a boy with ADHD. But there's something else. There's one test your son never wants to fail, and that's the test of his masculinity. Girls don't have to prove their femininity, but boys and men, we are forever having to prove it. And we don't have to prove it to girls, we have to prove it to other boys. Boys are told from a young age, man up, shake it off, big boys don't cry, grow a pair. Masculinity means always knowing what to do, always being competent, and never ever showing any vulnerability. For a boy with ADHD, school may make them feel less in control, and so what they're going to do is they're going to shut down, they're going to become disengaged from learning, because that's a better choice than feeling like less of a man, feeling incompetent. Furthermore, boys gain their status in different ways than girls do, and this is also something that's really interesting. Girls gain their status by who they know, who they're friends with. So they tend to use Instagram as a way of mapping who's friends with whom, and there's a whole level of status, who can like whom, what you can say. Boys, on the other hand, gain their status not by who they know, but by what they can do. Whoever can hit the ball the farthest, whoever has the best arm, he's the top dog. He's the one everybody else looks up to. However, they don't gain status by who gets the lead in the school play, who makes the honor roll, who gets the solo in the violin concert. This is why most boys affect I'm too cool for school attitude. You see them all the time. They use avoidance, they use denial, and they use it to avoid feeling overwhelmed and inadequate. They say things like, I won't be one of those nerds who studies all the time. So this is the perfect storm. Your son's ADHD, his need to separate, his rejection of help when he needs it most, and his quest to prove his masculinity. They all can put him at odds with school achievement. So as a result, what happens is you, because you care about him so much, because you're worried about his future, and because you know how smart he is, you become more anxious, and then your desire to do even more for him becomes stronger. That's when overparenting starts. Helicopter parenting. Or as they say in Sweden, curling parenting, because you're sweeping all the obstacles out of the way. So the solution to this problem lies in a different paradox. And that is, when it comes to teens and motivation, less is more. Less reminding, less rescuing, less nagging, less nudging, less lecturing, less pleading. That's because the more you do, the less your son will do. The more you worry and take responsibility for your teen's future, the less likely he's gonna do it. So this does present a problem, because up till now you've been having a very, I assume, hands-on approach to helping him to stay organized, as I said before, to stay on top of his work. Maybe you've hired a coach who's been helpful to him or a tutor. But now it tends to backfire. Now he's becoming oppositional. Now he doesn't want your help. So I'm going to show you some non-intrusive ways to offer assistance. And these are all designed to help you avoid the trap of the paradoxical response. They also won't threaten your son's need to separate and to become a man. Now, they're not hands-on, so they may not seem as effective as what you were doing, but they are what's needed now because, again, the more you do, the less he's going to do. So in order to understand this issue of motivation better, I looked at the wide, vast literature on motivation. Our field of psychology has really done an excellent job of studying motivation, although there's not a lot that's been said about teenagers. So after reading the literature and getting a handle on it, I distilled it into the 3 C's, which I think apply to teens. The 3 C's of internal motivation. Now, what I mean by internal motivation, psychologists call it intrinsic motivation. It's the motivation that comes from within, rather than being told you have to do something, or even you better do this to get an A so you get into a good college. Ultimately, we want our kids to have a sense of an inner drive to do something. So the 3 C's are control, competence, and connection. We're going to start with control. Now, here's a quote from the sister of a young man I worked with. The mom related to me that his younger sister said, "Mom, don't you get it? Luke's problems are all about control. You try to control him to do his homework, and he controls you by not doing it." That was a pretty perceptive kid who said that. So internal motivation arises from the freedom to make your own choices, to be the captain of your own ship. This we call autonomy. However, autonomy is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It has to come with accountability. The whole point of autonomy is that you make a choice, you make a decision, and then you see how it turned out. And if it turned out well, then you learn that was a good decision. And if it didn't turn out so well, you decide, well, that wasn't the best choice, unless, of course, you're a teenager, and then it takes a few more tries. But eventually you get it. However, if we give our kids too much freedom, they're gonna fail. They're gonna fall into a hole that's too deep for them to climb out of. So I'm not advocating that you just let your son do whatever he wants. But then there's a question: how do you afford him autonomy, but at the same time keep him from running off the rails? I suggest using an approach that I call providing structure without control. By providing structure but allowing your son to run the process, you're giving him the space he wants but also needs to struggle with his anxiety. I think what parents don't realize is when he was younger and you were providing all the support, what you were inadvertently doing, and again, with the best of intentions, you were handling all the anxiety so he didn't have to. Now he's got to learn to handle it himself. And this is really important because so many of the kids that I see that go off to college, I'll touch on this again, they're not ready. They can't manage the anxiety because it's been done for them. So doing this will providing structure will allow him to struggle with his anxiety. Set parameters and then let him deal with the outcome of his choices by not rescuing him. So for example, when he stays up studying all night and then wants you to call him out sick from school, don't be so eager. I spoke to a parent last week whose son had 3 tests on Friday and a championship soccer game that evening, and he was the star of the soccer team. And so he said to his dad on Tuesday, "Can you call me out sick on Friday so I don't have to take these tests because I'll take them next week. I really want to get good grades." Now, many parents in this community that's very competitive, they would have called the kid out sick. But this dad said, that's not how we do things. That's not how we roll here. And you certainly can't be sick from school and then play in your soccer game. So let's look for another solution. Are any of your teachers flexible? Do you think any of your teachers would let you take a test the next week? And he said, well, yeah, I think there's one that would let me do that. So then the dad said, okay, ask him. And then what I want you to do is we'll let you stay home, come home early on Thursday from school. You won't be missing your tests and you can study. So that's exactly what happened. He went to school on Friday. He took 2 tests. He did well on them. This has a happy ending. They won the soccer game and he took the test the next week. So likewise, when he refuses to gather up his belongings the night before, don't, as a rule, rush whatever he's forgotten to school the next day. If you control less and structure more, your son is going to learn what we need them to learn: better time management and better self-regulation skills. These are the things that teens with ADHD need to learn so much. When it comes to grades, try this. Talk to him about his grades. Have a conversation with him about what he thinks he can get in each class. Don't expect him to get all A's. My feeling is that if your son wants to get an A, that's his choice, but he should certainly strive for B's. But there may be a class when he really struggles in. So set out some expectations. Ask him if he needs any support, any help to get these grades. Tell him the consequences if he doesn't meet these goals. If he doesn't, for example, if he's not getting the grades that he thinks he could, he probably has too much time on his hands doing other things, and so you're going to limit those other things like video games. Although I will tell you that you can put a kid in front of his desk and a computer, but you can't force him to study, but you can make it harder for him to do something else. So once you've done all this, leave him alone, give him some time and see what happens. This means don't check the online grade management system every day. That'll drive you crazy. Don't go into his room allegedly asking him if he needs anything when you're really trying to check to see if he's doing his work. Give him some time and then see what happens. Let him run the process. Okay, let's move on from control and talk about competence. Now, I have some good news for you. You've already read the best book on motivation there is. You have it in your house. You probably read it many, many times. It's called The Little Engine That Could. And if you forgot, this story is about a little engine, and she was tasked with the job of pulling the long train over the mountain to bring the good little boys and girls on the other side all the toys and treats they deserved. So how did she do it, this little engine? Well, I don't remember that there was an adult train in the background that was saying, if you don't get over that hill by sunset, you're going to be grounded. No, she said to herself the mantra, I think I can, I think I can. Psychologists actually call that mantra self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that if you can do something, you're going to be able to do it. You're going to do much better at it. In fact, it's the only way you have a shot, because people with self-efficacy, what they realize is that even though something is hard, even though they struggle to do something or feel anxious about it, if they learn more, if they study harder, if they acquire a new skill, eventually they're going to get it. They have that belief, I think I can. And so what happens is they're able to work through the anxiety and get going and take risks. And again, as I said before, and it's really important to reiterate, when you were helping him so much, you were actually inadvertently taking away his ability to learn how to cope with anxiety, to learn on his own. So now we want to teach them uncertainty tolerance, how to deal with their own anxiety, how to solve their own problems. So again, this is where it's really important to back off and not overparent. Because what we need to help our kids become is competent at being incompetent. Now, another way to develop competence comes from the psychologist Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindsets, which is really worth a read. And before we get into it, I'm going to ask you to ask yourself these questions. Do you think intelligence is something very basic about you that can't change very much? Do you feel you can learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are? Is it true no matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it a bit? Now, if you answer that you think you can get smarter, and the same goes true, I focus on intelligence, but it could be playing a musical instrument, it could be learning a sport, it could be anything. If you believe that you can do better, you can get smarter, you have what Dweck calls a growth mindset. And that's really, really having self-efficacy. It's really believing that if you persist, you're going to get better at something. The flip side of that is a fixed mindset. People with a fixed mindset believe that you're only born with a certain amount of talent and it can't change. It doesn't matter if it's a lot of talent or a little. You don't want people to see where the ceiling is because they'll know that that's as good as you can get. One of the a patient I had who was really one of the smartest people I've met was in a field that you could have there was a quantitative side to it, or there was more of a linguistic side to it. And he stayed away from the quantitative side of it, the logic and reasoning side of it, because he felt he wasn't very good in math. The reason he cited was because on his SATs back in college, when I met him, he was already a graduate student. Back in high school, his SATs, he got a perfect score on his verbal, an 800, but he only got a 750 on math. And he felt like that was a bad score, and so he was bad at math. So it doesn't matter how much you have, how intelligent you are. People with a fixed mindset, they think that if you're good at something, it comes easily to you. So the kid who comes in and says, "Oh, I got an A on that paper, and I just started it last night," they actually believe him. See, the person with a fixed mindset will say to themselves, "I can't do this." And the person with a growth mindset will say, "I can't do it yet." Now, to drive home this point, let me tell you about my friend Robert. Robert lives in London, and he works for a hedge fund. He's a bit of an eccentric guy, very interesting, and he got really tired of working at the hedge fund, so he wanted a new career. He decided he wanted to be a cabbie. Now, if you've ever been to London, it works a little differently than here. Cabbies are really respected there. It's a profession. You don't just get in and say, "Take me here." You say, "Can you take me here?" Before you get in, you knock on the window. You ask permission. So that's because it is a profession, and cabbies have to learn this huge body of information that since the 1870s has been called the knowledge. They have to memorize every street, every major thoroughfare, every artery, every vein that connects them. In London, they have to memorize a certain area where the pubs are, what the best restaurant is, where the hospital is. They're really, this is all before the internet too, by the way. And so when we were walking around London, around one of those nice squares in London that makes it such a charming city, he showed me two guys on a moped. One was driving, the other was turned around backwards on the back, and they were driving around the square, around and around, and the guy in the back was memorizing this square, and then he'd go on to another square and another square. Well, Robert decided at his age he couldn't store all this information, so he'd give up. But why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you because some researchers at the University of London had this really creative idea. They saw this as a great opportunity to measure whether the brain really changes when you learn something, whether you get smarter. And so they took a sample of cabbies who passed the test. They compared them to a sample of cabbies or people that took the test and failed. They did a brain scan, an fMRI, and what they found was a part of the brain that stores visual spatial information, the hippocampus. In the hippocampus, that part was actually larger in the cabbies who learned all this information. So you actually can get smarter. So you can go home, you can ask your kids these questions. You can challenge their thinking on having a fixed mindset. And most of the teenage boys I've worked with have a fixed mindset. You can tell them about Robert and that you can actually get smarter. Now, the last thing in terms of competence is to focus on the process rather than the product. Rather than focusing on the product, on the achievement that you expect your son to make, focus on the process. What that means is don't tell him how smart he is, tell him how hard he works. The problem is when you focus on the product, on the achievement, what you're doing is you're saying, this is what we expect. You're really smart and we expect you to do well. And then kids feel like it's an expectation they can't live up to. One patient said to me, when people tell me I'm smart or talented, it becomes a standard and an expectation. And another said, if I don't do something or don't do it well or excel, I feel inadequate. I would rather have someone angry at me than disappointed, which is really about shame. So when you focus too much on the product, you really, and a child doesn't achieve it, then they're going to feel ashamed. So before we get to the last C connection, I want to tell you a few more non-interventionist things you can do that will help build competence without being too controlling. And the first is scaffolding. Scaffolding is a concept that many teachers use. Scaffolding supports your child. It hovers in the background and provides support to them without them even knowing that you're doing it. It's supporting your child until he's able to do something independently. It's guiding him to do the things that are just beyond his capability. So you're helping him to master a skill or ability that he's almost able to do. You're actually, rather than doing it for him, you're acting as a scaffolding and letting him do as much as he can and then helping him. So it actually supports your son's executive functioning, whereas overparenting takes control of it. For example, I recommend many people do that for kids, younger kids who have trouble writing, that the parent type while the student dictates. So it's scaffolding if all you do is the typing, but it becomes controlling if you start making suggestions or edits or tell him what he should write. So try this. Make a list of everything you do for your son in a week. You may need a few pages of paper. Then look at it and cross off everything he can do for himself and let him do it. And don't use the excuse, oh, it's easier if I do it or it's too much work, because you're really robbing him of the opportunity to do everything I'm talking about. And then look at the remaining items and think of what parts of those items he can do for himself and let him do those parts of it. Now, here are some things you can do. You can say to your son instead of reminding and nagging him. First of all, people with ADHD have difficulty planning. That's a major executive function. So rather than plot out how he will write his history paper or complete his project, simply ask him, what is your plan? I recommend you say it so much that he gets sick of hearing it. What's your plan? What's your plan for bringing up your grades, for getting to soccer practice, for buying holiday presents? Now, if he says to you he doesn't know, you can say, well, you probably are going to like the plan I come up with a lot less than the one you come up with, so give it some thought. You're obviously going to have to set some parameters for his plan, like, will her parents be home? And here's a good place to use scaffolding by doing the following. Know your son's limits, what he can do independently and what he needs assistance with. That will help you to manage your own expectations. Manage your son's frustration by keeping tasks simple and postponing a conversation when he gets overwhelmed. And let him do the work, but ask questions along the way to lead him in the right direction or point out things that might be helpful. But please remember, regulate your assistance and give your son only the amount that he needs to keep going. Now, instead of nagging him about what he's not doing right now, you can ask him about his future self. Research has shown that people who procrastinate tend to be impulsive, so they have a poorly defined vision of what they look like, what their life is going to be like in the future. So you can ask your son, how's your future self going to feel about this if you make that choice? And finally, use mantras. There's a psychologist named Dr. Mary Salanto who's done a lot of research on applying CBT to adults. And she found that in her work with adults, she teaches them mantras that they're supposed to say to themselves. The idea is that you can repeat these to your son. And again, he may not like hearing them, but it's a way of reminding him without being too controlling. So here are some that came out of her research. If you're having trouble getting started, then the first step is too big. A place for everything and everything in its place. It's not in the planner. If it's not in the planner, it doesn't exist, and out of sight, out of mind. Now, when I was talking to her recently, we came up with one that may be more appropriate for teenagers. So let's end by talking about connection. I spell out in the book about improving your relationship, including how to communicate better with teens and avoid power struggles, as if that's possible. But I want you to take away from today the idea that you have to apply a growth mindset to yourself. You have to feel competent at being incompetent, because teenagers are going to let you know that you're incompetent. You're going to have to develop your own uncertainty tolerance. In other words, tolerate your anxiety so it doesn't spill over. Talk to your friends, talk to your partner, talk to your therapist. Focus on the process of raising him, not on the product. Parenting is not a skill, it's a relationship. Your son needs acceptance of who he is right now, not who you think he should or could be. This also means accepting, and it's a hard thing to accept, but parenting has its limitations. You can protect, nurture, and guide your son, but at some point he has to take control of his own future. The outcome of good parenting is not an 18-year-old who is ready to function on his own. It's an 18-year-old who is ready to embark on a lifelong process of growth and self-improvement. And I've seen lots of kids, as I said before, who go to college, they fail out, they get on probation, they come home, they go to community college, they take a class, they get a job, and they go back to school and they do okay. Actually, one of those kids that I work with recently texted me. He had seen my book in a bookstore and he said to me, who's going to play me in the movie? You need the compassion to understand that the problem lies not solely with your son, but rather with a world that asks too much of him as a boy, and that he's eventually going to get there, but he needs more time. You have to remember that he's still growing. There was a boy I knew, actually, who some years ago, his parents were worried that he wasn't working in a way that was commensurate with his potential. So they asked him to take his computer out of his room and put it on the dining room table to do his homework. He said, okay, as long as he could turn the screen away from them. They agreed. They couldn't understand why he opened the credenza, the china cabinet behind him every time he did his work, until it finally dawned on them that they would be able to see the reflection in the glass of his work. So he had outsmarted them. Now, I'm still in touch with this young man every once in a while. In fact, he called me recently and he said, Dad, can you transfer some money into my account? He's a graduate student in psychology, actually. And he said to me, I finally learned the secret of doing better in school, to work harder. I said, I've been telling you that since you were in the 8th grade. And when I was giving him inscribing my book to him, he said, here's what I want you to write. You're so vain, you probably think this book is about you. So if you only take one thing away from this webinar, it's don't project how your son is doing now into the future. And remember, as you see in front of you, the words of Winston Churchill, because every good talk has to quote Winston Churchill. Success consists of going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. And finally, in the words of Garrison Keillor, parenting forces us to be better people than we ever wanted to be. So I thank you so much for your time and attention this afternoon, for hosting me, and I understand that there may be some questions.
Yes, there are all these strategies and techniques you provided. One parent is asking, how do I implement these techniques in my 19-year-old young man? Is it too late?
It depends. That's a good question. It depends on the situation. Most 19-year-olds are in college, so if he's in college, then he's on his own and he's figuring it out. If he's not in college, it's a little bit more tricky. Someone had actually asked through the website ahead of time, that their son was home now from college and attending community college. Was it okay to make him get a job? And, as I said earlier, it seems the trifecta when kids are home is community college, a job, and therapy. So I don't think it's too late, because I think it's a little more complex and subtle, but you have to focus on avoiding power struggles, and you have to focus, again, on owning too much of the anxiety about what he's doing.
Another parent asks, it's been harder to motivate my 16-year-old without him saying, I don't care what you do. And this mother is at wit's end over here. I mean, I think we can all admit that it's hard for a parent. You say less is more, but it's hard for a parent to acquire that skill or mindset, don't you think?
No, I think it really is hard. That's why there's a lot in the book about how parents feel, and about the stress we feel, and about maybe even the need we have for our children to succeed. Because it is hard, but it's the only way. Because otherwise, what happens is kids just do less. And again, they don't learn what they need to learn in terms of not school, but in terms of how to do their work, how to manage anxiety. So I hear that a lot. That's a really common question. I'm glad it was brought up. I don't care what you do. The thing is, kids really do care. Very few kids don't care. And the ones that really don't care, they have more serious problems. I'm guessing that the parent who asked this question, her son does not fit in that category. They do care, but it's a really great way to shut you down. And kids, they're really good at it. They're good at pushing buttons, and they're good at figuring this out. But the approach of less is more really kind of works around that, because you're saying to them, basically, you don't have to care what I do. This is on you. This is up to you. We have certain expectations. If you don't meet those expectations, we're going to put certain things in place. But whether you do well in school, you don't have to care what we do, because that's going to be up to you. And you're going to figure it out. And also be positive. I know you will. You may not do it right now, but you will. And as hard as that is to implement, it really is the only way, because all the prodding, all the pushing makes for a very unhappy relationship. It makes for a very unhappy home. And I don't see it getting the results.
Mm-hmm. Would you apply a lot of the strategies you mentioned about boys and teen boys, to teen girls? I know you brought up gender differences, but I'm just trying, because there are a lot of people who are asking, what about my daughter? So I thought this might be an opportunity to sort of differentiate a little.
Yeah, no, if you have a daughter who opts out, I think that the strategies work just as well. I work because I'm a man, I work a lot with teenage boys. I have some teenage girls in my practice, and it's really enjoyable to work with them because they tend to talk a little more easily than the boys, at least in my practice. But no, I think the strategies work just as well. I was interested in writing about boys because I work with so many, and because these issues of masculinity, I think, play into it. But just to touch on it, men feel shame when they are vulnerable. The flip side of vulnerability for men is shame, or the other side of the coin. Women feel shame when they're not good enough. Women are expected to always take care of everybody, to always look good doing it, to never break a sweat, which is really a challenge for moms, because as a mom, you want to do everything you possibly can for your son, and you're going to feel bad if you don't. And I'm suggesting that threatens his masculinity, and you have to back off. But for girls, the dynamic is a little different. And the stereotypes are different, because there was a recent study, actually it wasn't so recent, but there was a study of recent stereotypes that we have about girls and women. And it's fascinating but sobering. The stereotypes have changed about what women can do in the workplace. A woman can do any job a man can do. A woman can go to college. It seems even funny to say that. The stereotype that persists and has gotten worse is that girls they can do whatever a man can do, but they have to be pretty, they have to be nice, and they have to be thin. And, I see that all the time in the girls, the rise in eating disorders. And so what happens, I think, with girls more so is that there's more of an issue of perfectionism. They put more pressure on themselves. So I think girls need to be taught to be assertive. Assertion is, educating people how you want to be treated. But again, just to recap, if you have a girl who opts out, I think that the same strategies apply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this mom asks, my son, who is 13, needs a tutor for ADHD and written expression disorder, but he is defiant about having one. Is there do you have any suggestions how I can talk him into it? I find that interesting because, you talk about the less is more aspect, which I think can be, have a lot of gray shades about what is less. So is there is there ever just a sitting down and trying to talk your teen son into doing something, or is that sort of taboo?
No, it's not taboo at all. But, talking and pushing and controlling are different things, right? I really encourage having a discussion, and I talk a lot about how you do that, how you use empathy and a technique called EAR that comes from motivational interviewing, to be more effective at talking to teens. So no, I'm not about just backing off.
Okay.
This speaks to a different issue, though. This is a perfect example of the teenager who's decided, I don't need any help, when you know that he does, especially since he has a writing disorder. But again, if you have it in your mind that the reason he's rejecting it is because it's about becoming independent and becoming an adult and threatens, I think it's easier to have that discussion. I think you can do a couple of things. One is to have a conversation with him, and before you jump to why he doesn't, ask him why he doesn't. Really get him to talk about what his concerns are, what his worries are. Validate them. If he knows that you are validating not agreeing with him, but validating his feeling, he's going to be more likely to have a conversation with you. This is part of the approach. And then you may find that he might prefer a writing tutor who's a man. It may mean that you find a college student who can help him and may not have the expertise that someone who's an LDTC has, but who he may warm up to better. You may find that you may have to say, you know what, we're going to do this, and this is kind of the approach. We're going to give you some time. We're going to not use a tutor. We'll give you some time, and I'm not talking about a whole semester. That's too long. Maybe a marking period, maybe 3 weeks. We're going to let you see if you can do it on your own. We're willing to give it a shot. Here's what it means to do it on your own. And if you can't, then we really got to revisit this tutor idea, because, it's possible to get through life with ADHD, with a writing disorder, but it's harder. And so needing help doesn't mean that you can't do it or you're not smart. It just means you need some support.
I think you brought it up, and I thought it might be a nice time to talk about it. You brought up that program EAR, and also having a discussion with empathy. Could you just get into that a little, because that would be a skill maybe parents can use.
Yeah, and motivational interviewing is actually a treatment for substance abuse. It's different than the 12-step program, and it's very effective because it meets people where they are. and tries to help them to weigh the costs and I'm not going to get into all of it, but the weigh the costs and the the burdens of drinking, and get them ready to stop drinking. And I used a lot of those techniques in the book because I use them a lot in my practice because it's much more effective to kind of bring someone to that place rather than to push them there. So the idea is, and this is something that's so hard for parents, but it's so simple, and it's what therapists do. When you go into a therapist's office, hopefully they're not starting the conversation and doing all the talking. Therapists are trained to let you do the talking, because if you do, so it's someone wrote a book called Duct Tape Parenting. If the first thing you do is to listen and ask questions, you're already way ahead of the game. But we don't do that because we want to help so much, because we have ideas, because we think our job is to be instructive. But if you listen first and have an open ear, and then affirm what your son is saying, or another word for that is validate. You feel this way, and then to rephrase it in a way that they know that you understand what they said. And again, it seems to me like you're saying, here's an example. Boy, I'll never do good in history. I hate the teacher, and what's worse, the history teacher hates me. So a parent's first response would be, your history teacher doesn't hate you. Who could hate you? You're so lovable. But the first response better off is, well, tell me about that. Why do you think your history teacher hates you? What happens? Well, she never calls on me in class. Okay, well, that's interesting. It could be that, so you feel like because she never falls, this is reaffirming, validating, because you feel like she never calls on you in class, she hates you. Now, that's not agreeing, that's just validating. And then, well, let's look at this a little bit more. Who does she call on? Does she only call on one kid? No, she calls on just about everybody else. Okay, well, where do you sit in the class? Now, if I keep making up the conversation, I'll make it up to go in a good direction. It doesn't always. No. But I think if you keep this approach going, your kids are going to trust you more, and they're going to trust that they can have a conversation with you, and then you'll get further.
Yeah, a mom asked a question that I had, and how do you make a transition to this sort of new paradigm of parenting? She says, well, you're both conditioned to the nagging, and both of us are miserable.
Right.
I can relate to, but I'm just saying, what kind of steps can the parent take? I mean, it's one thing. I mean, it's very persuasive when you talk about it, but do they basically, when they get back into that groove of nagging or worrying, over worrying, or trying to do they just sort of take a time out for themselves? I mean, is there a program they can follow, or? I mean, it's a good question. How does a parent recondition themselves to be this new sort of breed of parent?
Yeah, in order to write this book, I did a lot of reading of other books for parenting, self-help books, and self-help books always seem to follow a pattern of the first half of the book is all about the history of the problem, the definition of the problem, the description of the problem, and the second half of the book is what people really want, right? It's all about the techniques. So I said, I'm not going to write that kind of book. However, I ended up writing that kind of book to this extent. What I realized is that parents have to first understand, and this is why I talked about it in this webinar today, and it's why this is not your typical kind of ADHD, advice, because it's a little different, is that you have to understand you have to understand the developmental issues. You have to understand, if you're working with a boy, how masculinity plays into it. And then you really have to understand yourself. And I just touched on it here. I have, a couple of chapters in the book actually about understanding what your anxiety is and what's pushing you. Because in order to implement the program that is outlined in the second part of the book, you can't change your son until you change yourself. And even more than that, we have to realize that, we really can't change another person. Therapists know that. And you really can't change a teenager. You keep them safe, you're still parenting them, right? You're still guiding them, but at some point they have to begin to make the decisions themselves. And so I think that it is important to take stock in all that stuff before you just jump in and go to the program. In terms of going to the program, it's pretty simple to sit down with your son and say, look, this is not working. You're miserable. I'm miserable. It's not the kind of parent I want to be. It's not the kind of relationship I want to have. It's not the kind of relationship you want to have. So we're going to try something new. What we're going to try, and again, it's not, I'm going to let you do whatever you want, because that's craziness, right? we're going to try to put a structure in place, set some expectations, but then not be on your back every second about whether you're doing it. And so then parents have to do something with their anxiety. It's more about, Wayne, it's a really perceptive point, because I'm glad to be able to make it. It's more about parents managing their own anxiety than managing their kids' anxiety. Because if you manage your own and you back off, that's the first step. The second step, which is so important, is to realize that kids, boys, need more time. And more than that, they have more time. There's so much pressure going on. The next, I have a blog on Psychology Today, although I'm wishing it was on Attitude. But and the next one I'm going to write is about how at this time of year, every kid that comes into my office who's a senior tells me how they're not special, how there's nothing unique about them. Well, why is that? The paraphrase of that is going to be how the process of applying to college sucks the soul out of your teenager. We're so pressured to get kids to apply to college and to get into the good college that there's so much pressure on that we think we're going to run out of time. And I said it in the talk today, the goal of raising a teenager is not that they're ready to go off into adulthood at age 18. That's not the point. It's that they're ready to embark on a process of, lifelong learning and of making mistakes, taking risks, and continuing to grow. So that's I spoke a lot. I hope I answered your question.
No, that's fine. No, there's another question. How would the teen, it is an interesting thought, how would the teen accept a structure for activities that he's not motivated to do? My teen only wants to play video games and nothing else productive. So, I mean, that is sort of a challenge, no? To create a structure for something that they don't seem like they want to do?
Well, that's a challenge. And, we have lost the war on technology. It is really greater than we are. And this isn't just video games, but you think you've got that app covered and they're not going to do that on their phone, and then they've got some secret app on their phone. But, I don't know what you do when you get up in the morning. My cell phone is my alarm clock, and I'm, the first thing I do is turn off my alarm clock, and then I'm looking at my phone. So we do it also. But in terms of video games, first of all, video games are not all bad. And I'm not even going to talk about how they help, with visual spatial development. But that's not the point. There are a lot of kids whose social life is around video games, and they're saying to their parents, I'm with my friends, I'm just in the basement. And they really are. And I work with teens who have trouble making friends, and so their social life is in the basement, on the console. And eventually they move, hopefully with my help, to inviting kids over and to playing. So it's not all bad, but the thing is that it still has to be limited. You still have to say you can only play a certain amount of time. And I think that what then parents need to do is say, listen, you need to have an activity after school. I don't care what it is. You're not going to just come home every day. It doesn't. If you're not into sports, it doesn't have to be sports. You can volunteer. You can get a job. You can join a club. You get to decide, but you have to do something. And that's a structure, right? That's a definite limit, but it's not controlling what the kid does. And then making, and then following through so that the kid is engaged in something. And then figuring out a way to limit video games. In some houses it's none during the week. It can be an hour a day. The problem with video games is that they're designed, and this applies more to little kids, I think, than to some teenagers, but they're designed in such a way that if you stop at a certain point and you haven't reached the next level, you lose everything. So the conversation has to be not you have an hour to play a video game, but you have this time and you have to tell me or stop when it gets to the next level, so that we know maybe it's going to take a half hour and I'll give you a half hour more. Maybe it's not, and I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but you only had 40 minutes. You deserve an hour, but this is going to take an hour and a half, so you can't do it. We'll make it up somehow, because I will shut it off at the appropriate time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've run out of time. That'll have to be the last question. You did a terrific job, great insights and strategies, and wanted to thank you again for your insights.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these ideas, and these questions were great. They really made me think. They were very, very helpful. I hope that my answers got people thinking.
I think so. And once again, the sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar is Winston Preparatory School, a highly individualized and responsive setting for 10 to 20-year-olds in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. with learning differences such as language processing disorders, dyslexia, learning disabilities, Asperger's, ADHD, and executive functioning difficulties. Winston's unique model of education provides intense skill remediation and helps students build independence, responsibility, self-awareness, and self-advocacy. Key for our students is the focus on assessment-based remediation, a daily one-to-one focus program, skill-based curriculum, small, homogeneous class groupings, expert faculty, social emotional development, and a supportive community. Learn more about Winston and sign up for an open house by visiting www.winstonprep.edu/apply-now. Thanks everyone for being here. Bye-bye.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.